Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to the TheraPsil. I believe this is webinar 5 now on election and regulation discussion. This is part of our Legalize Therapeutic Psilocybin in Canada campaign. So thank you very much for attending to help us legalize psilocybin and get to a place in Canada where we actually have regulations in place of Section 56. We're doing these webinars every week, so thank you for joining us. And again, this week, it is election and regulations discussion. So we'll be able to provide everyone with a little update on what an election means, some of the pros, cons, and how TheraPsil will adapt. Let's just wait one more minute here for people to jump in. A little bit of housekeeping quick is there's also a Q&A and a chat box in the bottom. So please send any of your questions to the Q&A. And if you'd like to chat, you can do that in the chat. And I always like it if people could start sending off with where you're coming in from, as it's nice to see who's joining and from where in Canada. So first and foremost, I would like to give a land acknowledgement. I'm sitting here in beautiful Victoria today. And as such, I would like to acknowledge that this is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Wasanich people. Furthermore, I also want to acknowledge that the medicine that we're talking about today, psilocybin, probably wouldn't exist without all of the Indigenous knowledge holders who have kept it with us since its first beginnings. So thank you very much. All right, so today, again, we're going to be talking about the election issues, and I'll give you a quick breakdown of the agenda today. So right after this slide, we'll introduce Jim, who is joining us on today's webinar. And together, Jim and I will be talking a bit about basic facts about the election, our current campaign and how it's doing, and then also TheraPsil over the next couple of months, how we're moving towards regulations, candidate surveys, and how your voice can help us. We'll also be answering a ton of the pre-submitted questions, and then we'll have an opportunity for everyone in this Zoom as well to ask some questions. So without further ado, Jim, I'll send it over to you and would absolutely love if you could just introduce yourself before we start talking about the election here.
Sure. I'm Jim Doswell. I live here in Victoria. Actually, interestingly enough, if Canada ever lived up to its treaty obligations, is on this actually ceded territories of the nations that we mentioned. The Douglas Treaties were written for 14 nations on this island. And although Canada has never lived up to them, the Indigenous people of the island did agree that they would cede everything except their cultivated fields and village sites. So it's awkward because you've got the government who refuses to implement it because it would mean giving up a pretty big chunk of Victoria and other things like that, which they seem to find inconvenient. I am a patient at TheraPsil, and I volunteer my time to work with them and in any way I can. I believe in the mission. I believe in the approach that's being taken, and I guess from today's discussion on politics, I've run for Parliament in Canada. I know I look like a burned out old hippie, but at one point I actually was a politician. And I've worked extensively with this, both at the most senior level of the federal system and the most senior levels of the provincial system here in BC. As an ADM and as a deputy minister and as an assistant deputy minister. So I know a little bit of what I'm talking about, but not a lot. I don't come from a perspective here of saying that any party is better than the other. If you spend as much time with politicians as I have in my life, you're soon to recognize that it's hard to find a real good one. So they're all there for power. And thankfully in Ottawa, the power doesn't necessarily rest with politicians. It tends to rest with the mandarins and the deputies, according to the old British parliamentary structure, which was foisted upon us for the concept of continuity. So this election, no matter who wins it, but it's already pretty clear who's going to, but no matter who wins it, it's a not going to change a whole lot of the approach of Health Canada and some of the other people. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Jim, for joining us on this call and for all the work that you've done with TheraPsil. I'm excited to get through this presentation with you and start chatting with folks about what this may mean. So thank you.
Thank you.
So just some quick facts about the election here is this is Canada's 44th election. And it was called by the Liberal Party of Canada and Justin Trudeau on August 15th. So just a couple days ago, really, which means the election is to take place on September 20th, which means we'd likely see new ministers if there's going to be a new Minister of Health and other cabinet ministers appointed around October 15th. So in essence, there has been a bit of a lull in Canada. And what we at TheraPsil have already started to see is that now it is very difficult to get in touch with MPs, with the Minister of Health and anyone in government, as they're obviously worrying about their re-election campaign. And this was to some extent to be expected. So I just want to give a quick update again on where we're at with the campaign. And first off, for those of you who've been attending these presentations, you may see that this first number, 37 patients, is 2 patients larger than it was last week. So it looks like the government continues to grant exemptions for patients. However, not all patients, only some, and at which point we're still trying to figure out exactly who gets access and who does not. And we also are recognizing that there still is the issue of healthcare professionals, which there have not been more exemptions granted for. But nonetheless, exemptions are being granted. And this is good news, and I think something that we can be happy for. This being said, there are still many exemption or applicants that have been waiting. Right now, we've got 17 patients waiting, and now over 40 healthcare practitioners, some of which have been waiting 5 months to get access or to hear even just a response to their exemption. So by doing these campaigns and by getting the gracious support of many of the people who are our members and supporters, we've been reaching out to MPs, ministers, and folks at Health Canada, trying to show them that there's need for urgent responses to these patients. And I guess what we've worked on and now established with Health Canada is that we actually do need a solution to Section 56, which is really a process by which a patient reaches to the highest levels of government to get a response on their exemption. And what we have in front of us may very well be the proof that that is not only unconstitutional, but ineffective for many patients and healthcare practitioners. We've thus come to the understanding that what we do need is regulations in Canada. The regulations, we've seen this happen before back in the early 2000s when Canadians were first given exemptions under Health Minister Alan Rock to possess cannabis. Many of those patients were actually AIDS patients that had done quite a bit of work in advocating for themselves and each other. We saw the courts actually decide that Section 56 was unlawful and forced the government to move towards regulations. Now, obviously, we don't want to go to court, and the courts don't need to do what is common sense, which is why we've put together a regulatory mandate, if you will, or a regulatory proposal to the government. We've submitted that, and perhaps, Holly, if you could throw in the chat a link to that website, it'd be awesome if everyone could see that. And we've put together the following arguments for regulations. Primarily safety, and this is access to safe supply, as the 37 patients and 19 healthcare practitioners who have gotten exemptions to psilocybin, unfortunately, have not been given the ability to buy psilocybin from a regulated supplier. They do have to find it on their own. This was expected in the exemption, but still, we live in Canada and we can do better. Also, safety by trained healthcare professionals, making it clear that those 19 healthcare practitioners who got the exemptions did so that they could better treat their patients, see better patient outcomes and safety. Equally as important is the equality issue, timely and equal and predictable access. As Canadians, we all have equal rights and are to be treated under the law the same. So the question becomes, Why do some get access and not others? And how can we make it more predictable so we know whether or not we're eligible? What we fear is that there may be politicians or bureaucrats making decisions about people's healthcare instead of doctors, and ensuring that it's done with the fundamental justice and equality is exactly what we want out of regulations. So we want to work with government and not against them. And I think that's not too much to ask for government. And coming into the next couple of months, when we see a new government or the same government in power, the question will again be, how do we work with the government, not against them on this? So as our campaign has progressed, we've been working on expanding the access as we've spoken with veterans with PTSD. We've spoken with folks who both have active cancer diagnosis and cancer in remission. And over the next couple of weeks, we'll be chatting with people with anxiety, depression, cluster headaches, addiction, and some other diagnoses. In essence, though, it should be for Canadians in medical need, and that should be up to a doctor and a patient, not up to the highest levels of government. Now, Jim, I want to acknowledge that you were a huge help in putting together these regulations. And I just want to ask you, is there anything that you wanted to add here? I know that you have a habit of going on tangents, and I would love it if you would share some of your thoughts on the necessity for regulations.
Thanks, Spencer. I think the regulation package is incredibly comprehensive. And thanks very much to David, the lawyer in Calgary who works with TheraPsil for that, because I've never seen a guy who has got a better, attention span for detail than he does. He could be a bureaucrat, but it's an interesting approach to take, because I think it's part of an overall strategy that you hand them their work already done, which is always a welcome thing in Ottawa. If you can provide the senior bureaucrats with a tried and true method of regulating a new substance for therapeutic use, they're going to go for that a lot quicker than they are just straight up lobbying and straight up requesting. But I think there's also other approaches that we'll be talking about in other webinars in the future, and that you don't just throw the regulations in and wait for a response. There's other things you need to do to keep the pressure on government, whether it's the current government and the current minister, or it's a new government. And it doesn't matter who it is after this election. We'll have, I think, developing a strategy, or have developed a strategy that will start to force their hand in a few different ways, and potentially assist them in making a decision that they don't want to make politically. Like, let's be real. There's only two parties that could potentially form the next government. One's the Liberal Party of Canada, and one's the Conservatives. Neither one of them wants to necessarily step up and be in support of psilocybin right now. It's not a politically good thing, particularly if you live in Alberta or Saskatchewan. There's some really strong feelings about it in certain ridings, and particularly the Conservative Party doesn't want to be seen as being light on hippies. Although they seem interested in legalizing, I've read the news recently that one of their members is advocating for the legalization of poppers, which I don't think that there's any really known therapeutic use of, but anyway, it's crazy time in politics. And so right now, everybody keeps their head down. You keep out of the way of the politicians, let them go and promise the world. And when it's over, you find out who you're dealing with, and then we'll go from there. But the regulations are an amazing first start. No one has done this in Canada. And I think it's to a huge credit to the TheraPsil team that they came up with this idea of putting regulations in front of government that, they've already approved for cannabis. So it makes it a whole different game. Thanks, Spence.
Well, thanks, Jim. And I think there are some points there to understand too, and that I certainly want to highlight is, much of what happened over the 2000s and, through 2000, essentially 2017, and maybe a little bit earlier, even till now, is the government has been fighting patients in Canada on what is constitutional when it comes to cannabis and medical cannabis access. So again, using these regulations is essentially saying that what has been forced through the judicial system and through the courts is in front of us. You know, the fact that people do have the right to their own medicine, the fact that people do have a right to grow their own medicine if they can do so, and that, you know, that should be a decision for them and their doctor. Many of these administrative decisions, although many were administrative, many were also forced. So I do want to acknowledge that much of what we stand on here is the shoulders of giants who helped get us to where we are today with medical cannabis. And again, medical cannabis, not recreational, but medical, to a system where people are able to access what works for them in accordance with or working with their doctor. So yeah, I like to remind people that, you know, this is not the first time in Canada that we owe a lot of where we've got to the advocates of the past who have advocated for things like cannabis, and that this really is an administratively easy approach for a government that may not want to put too much time into this. So I guess what I'd like to jump to now, Holly, if you want to jump back into the updates and changes to our campaign, as we've sent out to many of our private members, as well as the folks on our newsletter, we've been asking over the past couple of weeks for people to send messages to their MPs, to the Minister of Health. And obviously, come an election, it's not that we need to completely stop that, but that it is time to slow down and redirect those messages in a way that is perhaps a bit more pragmatic. So what we've done is slowed down slightly communications with MPs and the health minister, as it was expected that when an election is called, folks are going to be a little less inclined to respond. And I know the way that it's been put by Health Canada is that they are in a caretaker position now. So the nice thing is in this country, Jim, I think as you said, is it's not all power is in the hands of the politicians. There are other folks that need to ensure that our country and that our government still operates, even in the absence of MPs who are otherwise there due to an election. So at this point in time, we are focusing heavily on Health Canada, who have told us that they've received the regulations. And we are right now working on getting a meeting with them and with the Director General there, Jennifer Sachs, who right now is really the only person available underneath the minister to discuss those exemptions. What we also want to do too is send out surveys to the parties and election candidates regarding their position on medical access regulations for psilocybin. I think it's pretty important that we engage these folks and that we rely on essentially everyone in this call here, along with many of our other stakeholders and members, in order to use them in a way to ask what their candidates in their riding, as there may be many, think about psilocybin. So for those of you who do think psilocybin access is important, we definitely are calling out and asking that you might support us in a campaign that we're going to be working on in the next week or two, so that you can send out letters to your candidates and to ridings to determine what their positions are on psilocybin. Jim, is there anything you want to speak to there? Anything in your experience through running it for Parliament that you think might aid us here?
If you're, one of the fun things to do at a time like this is, if you have the time or the patience, is to go to the all candidates meeting and ask questions. If there's an all candidates meeting in your area, or if there's an opportunity for a questionnaire that goes to all candidates, sit down and start talking about, asking them their position on this. Because right now, when I ran in many years ago in 2000 in Delta, I met with the Prime Minister after he he parachuted me into the riding. And Mr. Kachan said, you can get away with murder until you're in Ottawa. And so right now the candidates are not whipped. by any system. In other words, they're not forced to follow the party line. They can say whatever they want and whatever they personally feel, which sometimes sadly results in some really embarrassing situations. But right now, to ask them how they feel about psilocybin and the therapeutic use of psilocybin in Canada, I put them on the spot if you have the opportunity. And also in the leaders, if you hear the leaders are coming to your area, I'd love to see the look on Aaron O'Toole's face if somebody asked him about psilocybin. And not to mention First Nation rights, but asking him about psilocybin would be a fascinating point. I think from Jagmeet Singh, you would get probably a very considered answer, and from Annamie Paul, you'd probably get a fairly considered answer, and potentially from Trudeau, you might get an answer. But it put it out there to them and start, asking them, maybe write them letters in a very political time, just to see where they stand, and then to have those for later on to hold up in front of them. It's because right now they're free to say whatever they want to get elected.
Well, and Matthew Hunter here in the chat has a good question, is how do I find these candidate meetings? I have time. How do I find them? And is there a script? I mean, we can absolutely supply, a script. And I think that that's part of our job as advocates, is to clearly communicate what the issues are. So Matthew, we're absolutely willing to make a script available for you. And we're right now working on a letter, but a verbal script is absolutely necessary too. So we're happy to send that out. Jim, do you happen to know exactly how we can find these times? I would imagine they're posted.
Oh, of course. All the all candidates meetings are normally organized at the community level or riding level. And so what you want to do, like I noticed some folks are from one of my favorite parts of the world, the land of the Comox and the Puntledge people in the Comox Valley. Well, it's going to be probably the Chamber of Commerce or someone like that organizes the all candidates meetings. And in the smaller ridings like that, everyone shows up. In the big ridings like Vancouver and in Vancouver, Victoria, quite often the candidates, if they don't have something good to say, they just don't show up. But in the smaller communities and that, they need to show up because they need to try to switch votes and things like that. So I would check in the local paper, the Comox Valley Free Press is always a great place to find out in that area. But any of your community papers are going to be making announcements, and your community, what do you call them? The community television channels, the cable channels that represent the local area will always be talking about this. So they're a great resource as well. The other thing you can do is just phone. Each of the parties has in every riding has a phone number for the Liberals, the Conservatives, and so on. Phone any one of them and ask when they're going to have an all candidates meeting. And if they say that their candidate isn't going to go, call them chickens. But yeah.
I feel like there's quite a bit of support that as a community, the TheraPsil community here can do to share this information as well. So we tend to check our emails, Facebook, regularly, Twitter. I mean, if anyone knows of one of these candidate meetings, please share it with us, tweet at us, put it on our Facebook page. And we will also do our best to make sure that we share that with our members too. I know that one thing we can absolutely do as well is we can start to ask around and figure out who may be, the new ministers, coming in election, who may be taking place the Minister of Health, or how do we get to Patty's community meetings to ask these questions. So there's certainly a certain amount of work that we can do, and we will absolutely be doing all we can to be effective advocates and make sure people know about these meetings when possible. Jim, do you have any comment on that? Like, as far as election candidates, how we can start to predict who may be in positions or in the minister's position in the future?
Oh, who may be the potential health minister?
Yeah.
Well, I think right now the potential probably is that the existing minister will retain her role for a period of time and then be switched. I'm not trying to sound silly, but let's look at all of the combined polls right now, and the Liberals have never run a worse campaign. I mean, they have no platform. They don't know what they're doing. And they were the guys who called the election, and they're not ready at all. And yet they have a 51% chance of winning the most seats. And even if they don't win the most seats, they're going to form the government, because the Conservatives will never be able to form a coalition government or a minority government with the NDP. They would fall on the first vote. And so we're going to have, unless Trudeau does something so incredibly stupid, and it need to be a major boner, and God knows he's capable of it, but he's got to do something amazingly weird not to win this election but in a coalition. He is not going to have a majority, I don't think, which is good. And Liberals should never have a majority. They get kind of arrogant when they have a majority. This way, you're going to see a huge influence from people like the NDP and Jagmeet Singh, and even potentially, you could have a couple of, maybe one seat, maybe 2 seats for the Green Party, although it's kind of doubtful. Like I understand that Annamie Paul's seat's in danger, but I don't know how you run a national campaign when your own party's trying to throw you out. And Elizabeth May here on Vancouver Island, who does Esquimalt in the Islands, again, unless she does something incredibly stupid, will most likely get elected again. So you're looking at a minority situation in Canada. So, if you're anywhere near where Patty Hadju is, have a chat and try to use some influence. And also, Spencer, I just noticed that Jacinth Smith put in a really good question of why are we worried about this on a federal level if health is regulated by the provinces? And it's because psilocybin is under, Schedule I drugs, and also the criminal code. And the criminal code is a Section 91 power. It belongs only to the federal government. The provinces can make whatever decision they want. So unlike the United States, where you have California and Oregon and all these different states saying psilocybin is a good idea, MDMA is a good idea, in Canada that can't happen, because the criminal code is the federal responsibility, as is the determination of what Schedule 1 or 4 drugs are. And so I don't think we're going to have any problem with the provinces once the federal government's in line. And so that's a super good question, Jacinth, a super good question.
And thank you very much for answering it so well, Jim. That it's absolutely the reason why we're focused on the federal health minister. But also, something to remind folks is there's nothing wrong with going to provincial ministers as well, and speaking to them about this issue, as information is powerful. Letting people know, what issues they have in their province is powerful. And I will say that we've seen an incredible amount of support, especially here in BC, but also in other provinces from the provincial health system. But absolutely, as of the only person who can help us in Canada happens to be Patty Hadju.
And if I could, Spencer, as a person, I am not palliative. I have just very severe depression, anxiety, and PTSD from as I put it, a life of way too many adventures. And I like to put to a politician, and if you have the chance to speak to any of them, is, and if you're in that situation where you're waiting because they're not approving people right now, it appears, that are not in an end of life situation. And, my heart goes out to those people with end of life situations. But for those of us who aren't, does the government only show compassion at the end of your life, or are they willing to help you improve the middle or the rest of it? If your compassion is only for the dying, that's a very limited statement of compassion. And I think Hadju will understand that as well as any, having been a social worker and other things in her previous lives. And I think it might just get close enough that it kind of tugs on a bone or two here and there.
Absolutely. And one of the biggest, or I guess what's made it so hard for some people as well, and I do want to voice their opinions, is there have been other people, I think 5 other patients who are not currently in palliative care or with a terminal diagnosis, that have been given access to psilocybin along with 19 fully healthy, healthcare practitioners. So you're absolutely right, Jim. Deciding who gets access to compassion is not the role of the government. And if it was, that they'd be doing a very bad job right now of that. So moving it to a system where it is a doctor, the person who knows the patient best, is important. And I think where we're going to start seeing, and what we've been doing, is reaching out to our doctors and who are supporting every patient, keeping in mind that every patient application is supported by a doctor. Those doctors are serious, and they have, many of them have harsh words to describe the real pain that many of their patients are in. So it is a good point to acknowledge that not everyone that is being supported is in palliative care, but that compassion is to be given out to all Canadians.
I guess the only other thing I'd add to that, Spencer, is our Constitution and our Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada, which, believe it or not, I'm old enough to have sat on the committee that did the charter. And I'm representing British Columbia's interests in those days, together with a very large team of far smarter people than myself. We have one condition in there that says that if it's good for one Canadian, it's good for all Canadians. You can't have a prejudicial application of law. You have to apply the law fairly and generously across all Canadians. And so when the government says, if you're at the end of life, we'll provide you with these drugs, then they've decided that those drugs are okay, that they're not going to accelerate your death, that they're not going to lead to your sudden death, that they're safe and efficable. So therefore, they're safe and efficable across the board. And I think that that aspect of our charter will eventually be what probably provides us the route forward. But hopefully we don't have to go all the way to the Supreme Court to prove it.
Absolutely. And I believe you're referring to Section 15 of the Charter. Does that sound right?
That'd be it.
Yeah. So for anyone who's interested, that Charter of Rights and Freedoms is not as long a document as you might think, but it's complete. It's good. And I would suggest that you pay special attention to Section 7 and Section 15 of that Charter, and think about how that may apply to the many people in our situation.
And if you don't think that that charter has power, I know at least 4 people who claim to be the authors of one small sentence in the charter with regard to Section 35 rights, which are the rights of First Nations people. And it said those rights that may have existed instead of that exist. And by saying that they may have existed is the only reason Canada is today involved in the modern treaty process. And I know that I was a chief federal negotiator for Canada and a chief negotiator for 7 different First Nations in British Columbia to achieve their agreements in principle. And if we didn't have that, the government would be trouncing on First Nations as they have done for the last 100 years. So the charter has power, and it's up to the lawyers and ourselves to, fund the lawyers, I guess, to try to make those changes and make the government live up to the charter of our rights and freedoms.
Thank you. It's a very good point, and I think it will. I mean, it highlights the necessity for, I think, written law, written regulations, written things. And we know in the past, again, that same charter got people access to cannabis. And it's likely the same charter that got people access to medical assistance in dying. And it is the same charter that, in all likelihood, would get patients and healthcare practitioners access to psilocybin. But we don't want to go to court. Court is an option, but it's a bad one. And working with the government is the best thing that we can do. And I want to make sure we're getting on with the with the presentation here, because it brings us to a very important part, is the necessity for writing down and better understanding who gets access and why is the reason we've put together regulations. These regulations, and again, we've said that it's there for safety, equality, and predictability. And that predictability really is important, is we need to understand how the law applies to Canadians and make sure that that law upholds our Constitution. So I want to comment on the next thing that we'll be doing, or not the next thing, but what we will also be doing over the next, say, month or two as the Canadian government sorts itself out, is we'll be working with all of the stakeholders of TheraPsil, and we extend that to everybody in Canada, to provide feedback on the regulations that we've put together. And we'll be breaking it down into, I believe, 8 sections, and supporting the essentially analysis of those sections, and then allowing people to provide feedback so that we can have those access to psilocybin or medical psilocybin regulations reflect the wants and interests of not only patients, but also healthcare practitioners, family members, all of the producers of psilocybin in Canada, and anyone who wants to make sure that psilocybin is available. So I see it as an important thing that we'll be doing, and very important to bring to the new government when they're put in power, because I can imagine that that's probably a good time to get things done, and an excellent time to brief new ministers, new politicians. What are your thoughts on that, Jim? Is there anything that we may want to focus on?
Well, when you if you get a new minister, then you want to try to get in the queue as quickly as possible to start throwing information at them. But if you've got a repeat, then let everybody else beat their brains out for a week or two and give her a chance to relax and fit back into her office and, polish up all her little mementos that she has and whatever. And then come in with some very strong communications. And I think requests for personal meetings after the election is clear and everybody is overjoyed at having won or whatever, is a good time to start to do that and have some pretty serious conversations about not just the carrot of here are the regulations and everything else, but geez, wouldn't it be a shame if we had to go this route? And because there's nothing like a little bit of a stick to motivate a politician to, because they can't just go into cabinet, and nothing happens in government without cabinet. And so if they've got to go into cabinet and say, I want to legalize psilocybin for therapeutic use in Canada, the first thing is going to be, well, why? Well, if we don't, they're going to do this. And do we really want to get it tied into a legal battle over people's lives? Do we want to have that emotionality on the media all the time? We're a new government. We can do some things right now that we couldn't do, say, 6 months before the election. And so the first year is a chance to get a government to do things that they would never do in the third year or the fourth year. So yeah, it's get them while they're shiny new, and they're looking down the road, because in politics, as you can see in Canada, like, everybody's going to balance the budget in 10 years. Well, that's 2 terms. So that means you don't have to do dick all, And by the way, if you don't reelect us after 5, we'll never get this balanced. So politics lives, and politicians live in 5-year cycles. That's as far as their mind casts forward. They are totally incapable of long-term planning, because their life ends in 5 years. Well, it doesn't end if they get 2 terms plus so many years, because then they get a pension, they don't care anymore. But their fame ends at that period at least. And so, yeah, we have some wonderful opportunities in the first 6 months of this government.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that, and all the more reason to be very prepared for those first 6 months.
Oh, yes.
So I realized that in that, I just want to make a quick comment, a small piece of news on the mandamus application. As some of you may have heard, that we are talking about, a stick, and what is that stick? And as Jim said quite clearly, it is the fact that we're willing to take this to court, but we realize that that's not a win. That is a loss. That's a loss for the government. It's a loss for us. And when I say us, I mean the patients and the healthcare practitioners who otherwise might be heard, listened to, and supported by a government instead of having to fight. So we don't want to go to court, but are prepared to. And the process by which to go to court has already started, starting with a mandamus application, which is essentially forcing a decision to be made on an application that's been outstanding 167 days. And the idea is that through a mandamus, we would challenge was Section 56 put together just to be ignored? And I think we can all agree that the answer would likely be no, especially because it's to a health minister. It's a medical purpose, and 167 days waiting is an unreasonable amount of time. But we will let the judge be the judge of that. After that, then we do have the possibility to move forward with judicial review. And upon judicial review, if it's unsatisfactory, that's when you may move to constitutional challenge and challenge the constitutionality of folks not getting access. So it's a small update, but it certainly does mean that we're on track to, in fall, late fall to early winter, be prepared to put forward a charter challenge if the government is not prepared to work with patients and healthcare practitioners. And that is not coming from me, but from the patients who are going to court, because it's not my battle. So I think it's probably a good time now. We've got about 15 minutes left to jump into some of the questions. So I guess we can jump back onto the slideshow, or if it's easier, I guess we don't have to do that. Holly, I know that many people submitted questions before this, so feel free to send some of those our way. And if there are any unanswered questions in the Q&A too, or the chat, we're happy to answer those as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Spencer. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining this afternoon/evening. A lot of the questions are kind of similar, so I'm gonna lump some of them together. One of them being, is any particular party more in favor of psilocybin therapy or more likely to legalize it than another?
Now or after the election?
Let's say after the election.
Oh, after the election. Yeah, probably. I think the NDP, probably, and I'm not NDP. I'm nothing anymore. But I think the NDP would be. I think the Green Party would have sympathies. I have a very dear friend who ran for the leadership of the Green Party and lost to Annamie Paul, but he is a very strong believer in this. And I think the Green Party has support. But of the governments, or the parties, sorry, that could form a government, well, I'll be blunt, I don't think you want the Conservatives. The Conservatives have this need now in Canada, not dissimilar from the United States, to cater to this small rump of about 20%, maybe 17% of Canadians that are angry about a lot of things. And they're angry about things that most of us don't quite understand, but they're angry. And they're certainly not in favor of drugs, because, that's basically what hippies do. And God knows if you're a good, redneck, you don't like hippies that much. So the Conservatives have a tendency to cater to that small minority of Canadians. And it is thankfully still a very small minority of Canadians, but they're vocal, and, they're represented weekly by Rex Murphy and what's his name? Conrad Black, the convicted felon, as they rail against Canada for all its sins and so on. So I don't think the Conservatives will serve us or the interests that we may have in legalizing the therapeutic use of psilocybin or any other drug. As a matter of fact, I think they would tend to basically die on that hill. The Liberals, you're still going to have to force them. because they're not going to want to make this political decision. There's a certain cowardice there, and you're going to need to make it more uncomfortable to sit where they are than where you want them to go. And so it's, you know, a little bit of love and a little bit of anger. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, and I'll also comment on one of the questions that came through the chat too, is might we be able to open conversations with conservative folks by appealing to their civil libertarian interests? And again, let me know if I'm on the right line here, Jim, but it may be possible that, you know, that some conservatives are interested in that, especially if we're able to keep, you know, the regulations, which, I mean, to comment on, they are very conservative as we've built them out right now, or as they are built, right? We're talking about 1 dose of psilocybin with a doctor and a therapist, you know, going through inclusion criteria, GMP certified. I mean, it's a hell of a lot safer than what the current government is allowing right now through Section 56, a lot more conservative. And it is, again, we're focusing right now on treatment for people who have, you know, tried many treatment options and who that's failed for. So I certainly think there is an appeal here, you know, about civil liberties. And I think that it's not one that all conservative members would be completely opposed to. Again, it would just be a challenge. And so, you know, my personal answer to this question is there a government that's open to this? I mean, just looking at the past magnificent year and a half that we've seen regarding liberalization of access to psilocybin, a lot's been accomplished in the last year. Is the Liberal government is already making moves, and I would hope that they would finish what they start. And I certainly hope that Patty can finish what she starts, because there are many people who have exemptions now, many people who are waiting and expecting exemptions, that would like to see those exemptions either agreed to or granted, or a no, so that they can move on to court instead of being delayed. So I do have quite a bit of hope in the current Liberal government. I would say that the question of should we be talking with conservatives is absolutely, and that's an excellent angle to take. You know, civil liberties, is that not something that makes perhaps more sense even? And if one way that we've wanted to spin it in the past is, does it not make more sense that we would give someone the right to try psilocybin before, you know, they realize the right to die with medical assistance in dying? Recalling that that's where we started, and if I may say so, that's where we did actually get quite a bit of conservative support in the past. Whether or not the party supports it or not is another thing.
I see a diplomatic post in your future. I don't disagree that the civil liberties argument is always a great one to put to right-wing people. When it comes to drugs, sometimes the civil liberty issue kind of tends to fall behind a little bit, but I don't disagree. Talk to conservatives. I mean, if, you know, it's certainly, don't close, you know, I'll talk to anybody about this issue, and it doesn't matter who they are, but I'll also call BS pretty quickly if I know that they're just stringing it. So I guess I do agree. You can't close any door in a parliamentary democracy. And so, you know, if you know, something happens and the conservatives form a government, well, we have to figure out how to work with them. And, you know, and the one thing I've always found is liberals, you know, run left and govern right, and conservatives, you know, run right and govern left. So, you know, it can be interesting times, no matter who forms the government. But a lot of it's going to have to do with who the deputy is. You know, the deputy is going to be the one that looks at the minister in a very sober moment, and the minister says, you know, I think that we should really move forward on this psilocybin issue. And the deputy looks and says, that's a courageous decision. You know, and if you don't think there's any words that strike deeper fear in the heart of a minister than those, I don't know them. You know, the other one is not only is that a courageous decision, but don't worry, Minister, we'll take care of that in the fullness of time. You know, so, and that's Ottawa, sadly.
I assume you mean the endlessness of time.
Yes.
Better that it's at least the same.
Awesome, thank you too. Mindful of time, we've got 10 minutes left. So are we in close contact with regulators, or is it difficult to get a hold of them?
And by regulators, I would assume we mean Health Canada here and the Minister of Health.
Health Canada in this particular instance.
Yeah, I mean, this is a bit of the problem, and I think what we've seen here is excellent communication. Well, as excellent as you might expect from MPs and politicians in Health Canada, regular meetings. We may not be getting the answers we want, but there's been some great communication. And I think where it started to deteriorate was in March, when the discussion became ever more focused on clinical trials instead of compassionate access, which is a shame, because that is where we started. Is we realized that clinical trials are the route to get access to new drugs. A drug in Canada needs a DIN, and the way you get a DIN is you go through 4 phases of clinical trials, and we understand that. But just because clinical trials are an option or available, which at present they're not for psilocybin, does not mean it's the only route. So communications have been have become more difficult, and especially in light of the election, it's been almost impossible now to hear back from the MPs, which I guess was expected, but what was not expected was replies from Health Canada that they are, in a caretaker position right now, because I believe that many of the patients who are waiting, would expect help from that caretaker position. And so it is more difficult right now than it ought to be. But we're going to continue pressing and searching for both responses to the existing exemptions and make sure that we continue to communicate, regardless of whether or not they're going to be responding directly to us. We're going to move forward with, creating amendments to these regulations and making sure that the voices of more Canadians are heard, asking candidates what they want and continuing to do what's worked in the past, share patient voices. Jim, I'm wondering.
One thing just really quickly, 60 days before an election, sometimes 90 days before an election, the clerk of the Privy Council in Ottawa will meet with the deputy ministers from all of the different departments and will let them know that they are to freeze any controversial actions whatsoever. And furthermore, that no approvals of anything that could come up in election should be proceeded with. This in some cases stops research, it stops trials, it stops all sorts of things. But the government is frozen until the election is over. Because I can assure you, as someone who kind of liked, my federal and provincial paychecks at different times in my life, you didn't want to do anything that made you a star of the election. And so bureaucrats are incredibly wise to just keep their heads down. And this is like, part-time holiday for a lot of the senior people. They're eating a lot of lunches, but they're not doing much.
Well, and I wonder if in that, you don't want to become the star, is inaction sometimes the wrong action, right? If something is pressing enough, is there a way that we can make this more of an issue with this election?
Sadly, in Ottawa, Spencer, inaction is never the wrong action. No one ever got fired in Ottawa for not doing something.
Yeah.
It's kind of doesn't happen. And so what you're dealing with in reality these days is everything's just sliding. And so can you put pressure on? Oh, of course. And we should continue to communicate with the deputy, and we should continue to communicate with the senior people in Health Canada so that they have an absolute flood of things to deal with from TheraPsil when all of a sudden they can open their eyes and start moving again. And we sure should be helping them with their briefing books for the new minister. Mm-hmm. Because right now, believe it or not, pretty well everyone in Ottawa is writing a briefing book. And whether they figure they're going to get the same minister or not, they're writing a briefing book just in case. And so can we have input into those? Of course. And that's always a helpful thing to do. But there's no action that comes out of that. It's just information.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Awesome.
Thank you. Is there a way that we can pressure the party leaders and make this a real election issue, something that's discussed by each of the federal leaders?
No. I'm sadly no. This isn't an issue that any political leader wants to bring up in the middle of a campaign. And I mean, it's near and dear to my heart as it is to everyone on the call today. But no, this is a long way from what's going to win them, you know, Joe and Ethel's vote. You know, we're not a majority. And it's a small, almost secular issue. And no one's going to, no matter, I mean, Jagmeet Singh could have a member of his family as a patient at TheraPsil. He's still not going to bring it up in a leaders debate, you know, because it's just potentially more damaging than it is beneficial. Sorry, but
that's fine. And the truth does not always have to be pleasant, but nonetheless, I think it's a good place to start to close off this webinar and acknowledge that you know,
a very negative page.
Well,
sorry. There goes Grandpa.
You didn't let me yet, Tim.
Roaring down the hill to bayonet the survivors, you know.
Well, I think that the way we would spin that is that what we have seen in the last year for a small group, right? A small group of people who started this off. Remember, it was only 4 patients. It was only, you know, a handful of healthcare practitioners and a very underfunded team, and with no, you know, social media following, that was able to really, in my opinion, move a mountain and get the first exemption in 50 years. So although it is not an election issue, it doesn't mean it's not an important issue, and it's not one that, you know, come the time of voting, that we will be able to make a bigger issue. And I really do hope that in those briefing notes there is discussion about psilocybin. I mean, there's no doubt that in that a rising tide is lifting all boats, and where people are talking about mental health, where people are talking about COVID stress, about drug use, that there are many applications for psilocybin to help those people. And I hope that, you know, much of the work that's being done by other organizations, by researchers, is going to aid, you know, many of the people that are searching access to psilocybin. So I do see this as, although it may not be something that we can influence in the next month or two, it is something that we are now blessed with quite a bit of time to put together quite a large campaign in light of any court action that needs to be taken. So yeah, I just want to, you know, thank you, Jim, and thank you, Holly, and thank you everyone who's attended this meeting, because although, you know, we may not be able to get the answer we're looking for today, the future is definitely bright, and I'm definitely looking forward, you know, to putting together these regulations, briefings, and what's to come in the later fall and early winter with the new government. So, Jim, thank you so much for joining us and for lending some of your knowledge and expertise on the matter. I really appreciate that, and clearly everyone in the chat does too. So thank you so much. And for everyone who's attended, again, thank you so much for the support that you've given to TheraPsil so far. Even just attending this is a huge amount of support, and every share means we reach another Canadian. So really, thank you so much.
And all I'd say is thank you all, and if any of you have questions that you think I might be able to answer, please focus through Holly and send them on through. I'm more than happy to either chat with you or deal with you from a email perspective on any of the stuff that, you know, I'm personally going through even with this. And I guess, you know, this team at TheraPsil has changed my life. And they're a pretty amazing group of people. And so feel supported out there, because you really, truly are. Love to you all.
Thank you, Jim. All right.
Gotta go, I'm gonna cry.
Oh, you make me cry, Jim. Thank
Awesome.
you.
Well, and I also just want to take a moment here to let everyone know that we do have 23 days left on a fundraiser that we're working on right now. Every dollar is matched. So I think where are we at? I think we're almost halfway through the fundraiser, trying to get to 120,000. Every dollar is matched. So any donation that you can make is greatly appreciated.